to the grand finals of Uhuru Worlds 2023. So I would now like to invite all the panelists to introduce themselves in the order as they're presented in the tab. So starting with Ananya.
Hello everyone, I am Ananya. I am finalist for this round. Congratulations to everyone for making this far.
Congrats everyone, and best
Cracking over I thank the speaker for that fine speech, calling up on the LO. Here, here.
Give me 1 second. Also, POIs in chat. All right. Also, just before I start, big thanks to Matt, who's been up at ungodly hours to do this tournament. I've had a ton of fun doing it. It was great. Good stuff. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Let's be very explicit about the comparative here. Brown versus Board of Education never would have changed because that was on the right to equal protection, which is textually explicit. The comparative is that Roe versus Wade, which was on the interpretation of, oh yes, the bodily autonomy comes under the idea of right to privacy, was explicitly contradictory to the intention of the framers, who did not want right to privacy to include bodily autonomy because that was not a conception that was important to them, and the idea that abortion and things like this did not exist as a conception back then. So therefore, the intent of the Constitution was not to allow that. They cannot stand over things like versus Roe versus Wade, because that is just not their side of the motion. What we're going to say is 2 very simple claims here. First, there is a principal obligation of judges to make sure that you are making decisions that are aligned with the preferences of the present. But second, why policy path is significantly better on our side. First, some framing. This is not about allowing women to vote. I think that's the constitutional wording of all people are created equal would allow for this to exist, for the very reasons that opening government give you, by the way, which is that there's general liberal principles which are textually good for the incorporation of basic rights. So basic rights presumably, I think, exist on both sides. But while on both sides there is vagueness, Anna's correct about this, the question is, where do you have choices to make? Because where you have to be ascribing yourself to context, you are ascribing yourself to the context of people of hundreds of years ago. You have very limited flexibility there, but because you understand them to a limited extent, and because you are pigeonholed to what those people's political ideologies were. Because even if you are textual, you are able to use those textual interpretations to incentivize and agitate for change, which is what we're going to push on opposition. First, the principal claim. There's 2 parts to this. The first one is the idea of prioritization. Note that we believe that people are coerced by the existence of a state, which is that when you exist under a state, the state controls your life, and that the existence of rights or existing or not existing by a state means that you will have those or not. And that if they do not protect your ability to get an abortion, you will never have that, and that creates you like tangibly less agency and less freedom for you. And that the state is able to control these things because the state was the one that passes these policies. And that it is morally arbitrary that you were born within the state that will constrict your rights. Specifically, we think that it is morally arbitrary to prioritize the preferences of people born hundreds of years ago for 2 reasons. Number one, they have no claim to be more important than you just because they're born earlier. Your time slice in history in which you exist is deeply morally arbitrary. I don't know why you matter more just because you were existing back then. And so therefore the opinions that you had or the people around then had should be prioritized more than the opinions of people now. But second, on fairness, these things are balanced better when they're done by textual interpretations, because even if you interpret these things to the text, they are done in the context of a brain of a present person. As in, sure, 2 people are born at very different times. Their interpretation of what people being created equal means is probably very different. And so therefore, they will use that in very different ways, in that somebody born in the 1700s, their definition of people, unfortunately, in awful ways, does not include people of color, but now it does. And so therefore, these interpretation changes are likely to exist. But even if you say that judges in the present day have bad incentives, note 2 things. One, they have certain moral intuitions that are in line with the average individual. Brett Kavanaugh might not be against abortion, but he's willing to say that Black people are human and are not 3/5 of the man, which is what it says in the US Constitution. If not this, then a 1960s man will have a better idea of what women deserve than a man born in the 1800s. But second of all, they are closer to the moral intuitions of the average individual than the moral intuitions of the past, which are very radically different. They're influenced by different contexts in which things like monarchy existed and resource struggles were very different. So people had tangibly different prioritization. So therefore, on prioritization, things always ought to be enforced closer to the present than the past. Second claim, obligations of a judge. Know that judges have massive ramifications in people's lives, in that oftentimes the things that they will do, the things, interpretations that they make, will literally affect whether or not you have certain rights, or whether or not you're going to have, for example, criminal sentences and things like this. So therefore, that means they have obligations to, 1, make sure that action is proportional, but 2, to balance out a variety incentive given the relevant context, which is why we have judges trained in using precedent to evaluate things like mitigating circumstances and theft cases. Why is that better on our side? Two reasons. One, the capacity to enforce. You will never understand past context as well as you will the present. You were not there. You've been raised in a different environment. And even if not, even if you've been educated in that, which Gov is going to say in DPM, your notions of the past are preconceived based off the interpretations of the people around you. For example, in the United States, the founding fathers are valorized, versus in India, the colonizer is rightly vilified. And so therefore the interpretation is radically different, and you never had a choice over that, and your capacity to make rightful interpretations based off that understanding of the context is remarkably limited. But second of all, the capacity to be able to use this present context to enforce the Constitution using the word of the law is remarkably stronger as a result of this. But finally, you have a greater obligation to present people. Past people are not alive. Their preferences matter less because the choices that you make will have less of an impact on them. But finally, you have an obligation by capacity for changing a life. If you walk by a river and you see a child drowning and you have the ability to save them, therefore you should save them. The fact that the state that cannot change things for the past but can change things for the future means that the obligation will always lie in this direction, and that is a principal burden that opposition needed to do something about. Second, policy. We don't know that judges will always have good or bad incentives. In some contexts they will, in some contexts they won't. Where they do, our other arguments kick in. In cases where they don't have good incentives, we will moderate their biases better. The reason for this is simple. Constitutions are hard to change. Therefore, we would prefer for the policy impetus to be concentrated around policies themselves rather than constitutional changes. Because be very clear here, on Gov, policies cannot be passed that contradict the Constitution. As in, when they decide that Roe versus Wade cannot exist because the contextual interpretation of the founding fathers was never to have the right to privacy include abortion, that means that you cannot pass abortion policies without amending the fucking Constitution, right? And so that means that you cannot change these things. Versus on our side, the comparative is that when we know a textualist interpretation is the norm, we can get changes. How do these happen? First, when we know that textualist interpretations are the norm, judges are unlikely to contest them, and Supreme Court challenges happen more frequently, so therefore policy is more powerful, which is good in and of itself because people have more control over policy than they do over constitutions because they vote into elections and things like this. Before I go into more detail on this, I'd like to take closing.
Is it just for a judge to rule in a way which fits the majority of the population's will?
I mean, yeah, but if that's wrong, then you can get policy to change that, which is stronger on our side, which I'm proving now. So I think textual interpretations, back to the point. Textual interpretations more frequently align with what people in the present want. If it's the US Constitution, abortion just didn't exist back then. So ambiguity in that textualism never has an answer for abortion, allows policy to be king. But it's a developing nation, when things cannot be changed, that incentivizes policy workarounds, like protections for minorities, even if they aren't constitutionally protected because it's supposed for the necessity of it. And because of this, there's less incentive for you to also stack the court trivially because they're less of a kingmaker. Why is this good? Two reasons. One, we would rather have political capital going towards policies like abortion protection as opposed to changing constitutions. One, because changing constitutions is remarkably hard. You need super majorities. And that means that for people campaigning for that, that's a lot of work. It feels very hard. You have to get a lot of people on side views that less people are willing to vote on those lines. And it feels like a hopeless lost cause. So you don't get the impetus to change in the first place. But second, it's more polarizing because it's a bigger step. And any specific change or implementation is likely to have corollary impacts. For example, opening the door to abortion opens the doors to other protections of bodily autonomy like gay marriage, so therefore even pro-abortion Republicans are likely to oppose these constitutional amendments. But finally, why is policy good and likely to pass? One, people agitate on things that affect their lives. This is asymmetric because it's a smaller step to pass a policy than to change a constitution. Therefore, sacrifices like petitions and calling your legislators and protests are far more likely. But it's also politically easier to get these things into large packages of legislation, whereas you cannot do the same with a constitutional amendment. We are remarkably proud to oppose this motion.
I thank the speaker for that speech, calling upon the DPM here.
Hello, am I audible, visible, all good?
Yep, you are.
Cool. I'm just going to talk for slightly longer because there's a huge storm and I hope I'm not buffering. If that's fine, I'm going to start in a sec. Cool. I enjoy how LO literally changed the wording of the Constitution because for the American Constitution, it doesn't say all people are created equally. It says all men. And in majority of scenarios, I can translate this into my language, but it doesn't matter because most constitutions refer to men. They refer to people as being men because that's the perceived way back then. Moreover, I think that in the cases where this doesn't happen and constitutions are more inclusive, that also means they're significantly more recent, right? So that means they're probably made after after 89 when the Soviet bloc has been disbanded, or they made post-colonialists, or so on. So that means they're a lot more recent. Thus, we can understand the context a lot better. Why is this important in the debate? Because I think that the majority of OO content falls because most of it is just saying constitution should be interpreted as close to today as possible. Yes, I agree with the entire LO speech because they never managed to prove why textualism is closer to what we currently believe than understanding that you actually have a context and we should interpret it based on context. Note, there's no mechanism on the part of OO why having the words, and this is a quote, 3/5 of a man when you're talking about black people, how somehow that is not textual. It is the literal interpretation of the word. So what they have to stand for, and what would have been a reasonable argument on their side, is probably the fact that you have stability, so you can't shift around whenever you want. But that's not what they chose for. They chose to skew the definition because they don't want to play their side of the house. Note, it's really hard for you to change definitions of the word. That means that interpretations are extraordinarily stable on their side of the house. Compare that to context. You had multiple mechanisms on PM on why context can be interpreted differently. Firstly, because we automatically put the filter of our own society over them and we expect them to behave in similar ways because we believe human nature to be stable in time. Moreover, when trying to figure out context, how are we likely to do this? I think that we ask ourselves the following questions, probably more, probably less. Firstly, does this give or restrict rights? So for example, when you're talking about gun rights, this is giving rights to people, right? Moreover, which rights are they giving? That right is for self-defense against the government. Secondarily, I think that you're also asking yourself which people are deserving of said right. But when you're talking about men in the past, you interpret it contextually and you say that likely refers to citizens. Thirdly, you ask yourself, what are the limitations if there are any limitations? So to put this in a very concrete example, when talking about gun reform, what you're going to think of in terms of the Constitution is, one, what right is this giving? It's giving the right to self-defense against the government. So, is it necessary for me to have an AR-15 in order to fulfill that right of protection against the government or protection against intruders? Well, most likely not, because the founding fathers did not know of the existence of AR-15s. That's not what they intended in the current context. Thus, we should change it and we should restrict firearms that can cause mass deaths within the population. That's not what is going to happen when you interpret it textually, and it says you have a right to guns, whatever iteration or evolution of them. So that means OO is already out of the debate. The entire principle on how you should have significantly more focus on the present in order for you to have a constitution proves to us that the constitution that is closer to current reality is the one that is better. I already explained why it's hard for you to shift definitions around on this side of the house. But moreover, let's interpret this in the most accurate way possible. They actively mention how people look at the founding fathers or the people who are revolutionary. I think that in our perception of reality, even if it might not be true, those people were revolutionary, extraordinarily democratic, super progressive. Even Republicans believe that their founding fathers were extremely innovative and they wanted freedom for everyone and they wanted everyone to be perceived equally under the law. Because we have such a skewed perception of these people, doesn't matter if they actually were of any good or not. This proves to you that we will also have a skewed interpretation of what their intention was supposed to be. That means we're going to push more progressive burdens onto the Constitution because we believe that the founding fathers used to be more progressive in the first place. Now, this shows to you why it is significantly easier for you to push progressivism on our side of the house. Before I move on, I can take CO. 3, 2, 1, OO.
So there's a big issue here, which is that presumably, if you are right and there's as much liberal tilt to these that allow for broad interpretations, then you cannot have the wording of the motion where you literally preclude basic rights. You have to pick one of these.
So what we're telling you isn't that the definitions themselves are supposed to be extremely democratic and extremely liberal. Rather, that by forcing us to think about what the context is, we cannot, and it is impossible for us, not to put our own interpretation of what history is, which is a subjective interpretation. One, because as I already explained, there's like a, what do EPLs call it? Like a cult of personality for the people who are in the past, right? Also, it's very, very likely that you will believe this cease to be evident for you, even if other people in the past considered it so, because you come from a very specific frame of reference of your current society. That's why you're also going to extrapolate into history, believing that all people used to be the same, and it's impossible for you to conceptualize that you were thinking of things differently. What does this mean at the end of the debate? It proves to you that even Republicans, when interacting with constitutions, are more likely to have a better interpretation of this because they understand, okay, if this is about freedom to protect myself, I still have the freedom to protect myself, even if I have less AR-15s and more like shotguns or whatever the lesser equivalent of AR-15s is. So this already shows to you why we should win the debate. But moreover than that, I think that an a priori thing that we need in order for us to be able to change anything in the Constitution is for us to be able to pass said change in the Constitution. Will opposition ever be able to change it? Obviously not, because words don't change definitions that much, and even if they would, judges would interpret it with the previous definitions. That means that it is unlikely that you will be able to change constitutions through judges, so the only way opposition can do it is by having a supermajority to change the Constitution itself, not reinterpret it through judges. Why is this impossible on their side of the house? One, fear. You fear that the reinterpretation is going to be bad. You fear creating said supermajority and changing the Constitution because you see it as the very bedrock of your civilization. You don't want it to be tampered with. Secondarily, it's hard to get a supermajority. Thirdly, I think that it becomes a matter of parties and whether you trust that party with your life or with your Constitution, not a matter of rights, thus shifting the conversation and making it significantly less likely that people are actually going to shoot for changing the Constitution. That proves to you that even if we are uncertain whether we're going to have a more liberal or more conservative interpretation on our side of the house, the fact that we can change it more easily empowers us to make changes on the long term, besides the fact that understanding history through our current lens is always going to be more progressive. OG.
I thank the speaker for that speech, calling upon the dialogue here.
Valeriu, just give me one moment to adjust my setup. Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yep, you are audible.
Okay. There are three independent moral wrongs that GovBench commits. The first is the enabling of judge biases that exist on either side of the debate. I want to start out by establishing the biases of judges that exist. It's often the case that judges who come into power tend to be older, they're majoritarian, they're privileged, they've been in law school for long periods of time. The question then becomes, as Wajeeh points out, and DPM completely drops, which set of legal norms allows us to moderate those kinds of biases that ultimately exist, such that we can increase protections for minorities? Our key claim is that it is easier to call out when judges are behaving in bad and potentially racist ways when we are adopting textualist interpretations. And the reason is because everyone has an intuitive idea of exactly what that original text and original interpretation, ordinary text and ordinary interpretation is likely to be, which means that we can more readily call out judges when they behave in bad ways. And why is that call out likely to be effective? One, because internally, when you're deciding which interpretation you want to take up or whether something is constitutional, other judges internally criticize your set of legal interpretations. So you preemptively change your interpretations in legal discussions. But secondly, you don't want your legacy to be tarnished. You realize that legal critics and politicians will create outcry if they realize you're trying to manipulate the textualist interpretation of the Constitution. On the comparative, it is much, much easier for justices to veil their claims behind ideas like this is exactly what the framers wanted. So the above mechanisms I just gave you in terms of call out don't kick in to the same extent. For example, your legacy is actually improved on their side of the house if you abide by originalism when that's the norm. Why is this true? One, because of PM's own framing, they're intentionally vague. What does that mean? There is more room to manipulate your interpretations of the Constitution. And in as much as that vagueness exists, it's often the case that there are multiple parties involved in drafting the Constitution who had different interests, for instance, old guard and new guard policies. So it's often the case that you can specifically prioritize what one set of framers wanted over another set of framers, and that vagueness often exists in these constitutions. How does POG preemptively engage with this? They specifically say that the ordinary meaning of the text will say things like men or 3/5 of a human being. I have a couple of observations about this argument. These are very, very important. One, this idea clearly knifes their framing about why framers intentionally want the Constitution to be vague. What that suggests is that on a balance of probabilities, you are more likely to default to broader language, and in a plurality of instances, especially in newer democracies, you are less likely to use that bad kind of language in the first place. But secondly, this is semantic. The ordinary meaning of a particular word, i.e. the idea when you're looking about what men means in the first place, is colloquially implying all people, since ordinary is based on what is ordinary at the time of the interpretation, i.e. the present day. So if you look at what men means in terms of its ordinary meaning right now, it's likely going to be colloquially extended to all people. If it weren't, that would just be originalism, because that's what they intended, i.e. they explicitly intended it for just to be about men. So their argument turns against them. Two reasons this is strategically important. One, given the framing I established about why in many instances judges skew older than the population and are appointed arbitrary in ways which don't represent the views of the people on the ground, and they're unaccountable, the best thing that we can do is moderate those incentives by making them more appropriately representative. We do that better on our side of the house. So you're less likely to see things like removing abortion protections under the notion that the right to privacy, according to the founders, does not entail abortion, or in developing democracies, peeling back concessions that you made to minority groups because you thought that a set of founders didn't want a particular ethnic group to have rights in the first place. But secondly, this also has moral importance. The reason that we have institutions like courts and constitutions is because we believe that everyone is entitled to access the good. So a compromise we need to make in democracy is you have documents which enable rights for minorities, in as much as minorities too are able to access their idea of the good. And minorities are the most important to prioritize because majorities have other avenues of pursuing change. For instance, the legislature. So the unique role of constitutional interpretations is ensuring we can be more progressive in the first place to expand rights for minorities. Secondly, originalism is also independently morally problematic. Wajeeh already gives you all of the arguments about why it's likely the case that the people you're prioritizing are arbitrarily born hundreds of years ago, or even 10 years ago, and you're arbitrarily prioritizing the preferences of those individuals over the preferences of the people who are alive today. Why then should you prioritize people who are alive right now? One, dead people do not have rights. Any premise of any moral framework is the human will, but that will ceases to exist when you're dead, so we cease to have strong obligations to those individuals. Secondly, coercion to people who are alive today is active, and therefore we have a stronger obligation to stop it. But thirdly, let's give them everything they want. Past people are equally important. They had good intentions. We balance rights more on our side of the house because their input is already considered in as much as you're using the text that they wrote, even if it is textualist and just the ordinary meaning. Weighing on this argument, one, we do not know what is good. So in as much as we enable moral progress by prioritizing the ordinary views of people who are alive today, we better achieve that moral progress, and therefore we are more morally justified on our side of the house in as much as we don't violate the dignity of people who are on the ground. The third thing I want to talk about is why we get better policy and enable the passage of more amendments on our side of the house. But before that, if CEO has any, or CG has anything?
OG?
Yeah, sure.
Male pale stale wanting good legacy happens on both sides because tarnishing the forefathers is also bad. You're remembered if you push society forward. We also fulfill
your point. Our point is that in as much as you want to glorify the founders to a more significant extent, your legacy will be tarnished if you don't go with what the founders wanted. And I proved that judges have more room to side with the more regressive views of the founders. For instance, old guard and oppressive regimes like Chile, for example. So that's why your argument turns against you. Finally, why do we get more amendments engaging directly with the DPM? One, when you adopt originalist interpretations, that's more likely to venerate specific aspects of a constitution. For instance, the veneration that we see of the Bill of Rights which exist, which makes it much, much harder to actually pass amendments in the first place. Because anytime you pass an amendment, there's now political opposition, in as much as the type of textualist interpretation that you use affects the preferences of people on the ground. So there's less popular support for actually getting that amendment in the first place, since it seems like you're defiling the Constitution. It's the opposite on our side. When you're prioritizing the ordinary views of people who are on the ground, it's easier to make the persuasive claim that we should add this amendment because the Constitution isn't in line with our ordinary views in the first place, and it's at least less venerated since there isn't an emotional connection that comes with the specific ideas of the framers. But secondly, I just want to point out that DPM does nothing to engage with our more specific argument about why it's easier to get legislative for instance, policies on our side of the house. On their side of the house, you are more likely to focus on changing constitutions, which we've already proven is uniquely hard. We at least do it better on our side of the house. On our side, we focus more on efforts such as abortion or state and local level protections. They distract away from those policies on their side. That's also an independent path to victory for us.
I thank the speaker for that speech, calling upon to start the case of the lower house, the member of government. Hear, hear.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, great. Let me just get my timer up. Okay, I'll take a POI at around 5 minutes. Could you please put it in the chat? Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. A lot of what people have said in this debate so far is extremely symmetric. Textualists and originalists will generally agree you should not torture animals or that you have the right to a fair trial. In this sense, we're not so different from our 18th century forebearers. So where we disagree, right, is specifically where textualists must deliberately change the interpretation. They must subjectivize. They must view the definitions differently from how it was written by the founding fathers. And so textualists must take the constitutional statements out of context for there to be a break in symmetry between how an originalist and how a textualist would view the Constitution. They have to take it out of context from the time it was written. So therefore, they have to deliberately misinterpret it. They have to use selective definitions. They have to change the definitions based on modern definitions rather than the definitions that were originally created for that, right? I think overall, in this sense, though, flexibility probably exists on both sides. It's not to say that originalists are completely bound to this. Like, for instance, there is flexibility in the sense that people in that period of time often have different interpretations of definitions and different interpretations of Constitution, but also there is a degree, as OG says, of like broadness, which means that even within the Constitution, there are issues of clarity, like, for example, what's been brought up between like equality and like the use of the word man, which means that these things have to be mediated, of course, to an extent by subjectivity. So where does the change actually occur, right? What changes is who actually does the interpretation. Because on our side, it's not to say that we have to stick with the Constitution forever, regardless of how much oppression or harm it causes. Because we have an avenue to change, which is through congressional amendments, right? And so what is the comparative? The comparative is not whether we get change or we get no change, right? The comparative is whether we trust judges to make that change for us, or whether we trust the Congress to make that change for us. And I think there are several advantages to it. Okay, so firstly, with regards to why this is far more democratic, having Congress decide this rather than judges decide this. I think it's obvious, right, that Congress people are voted into office, so people vote them in. And so once Congress are voted into office, they're able to vote on the Constitution and whether any amendments need to be made to the Constitution. I think most people in society and the public agree that women ought to have rights. I don't think it's much harder for a congressman to get elected on a platform that, they're going to like reverse back women's rights. So I think it's very clear, right, that we're able to get those amendments because they're just going to have general public support, right? On their side, though, they rely on Supreme Court judges to make a textualist interpretation in order to modernize the Constitution. So we rely on their subjective interpretation more so in changing the Constitution rather than constitutional amendments. So I think why congressmen are much more representative, I think for several reasons. Firstly, they're voted in on a platform of what people care about. So people vote based on what they think about. So the congressman represents what society thinks is important, much more so than a Supreme Court justice who is unelected by the public. But secondly, right, Congress people know their constituents much better. They interact with ordinary people much more. They talk to their constituents, but they also have greater incentive to appeal to their constituents and appeal to what the public care about, because that's the platform of which they get re-elected. That's how they appeal to the general population. Notice on the comparative, judges are much less representative of what society generally agrees upon, right? Which means that they're much more likely to abuse, if they're made to do textualism rather than originalism, they're much more likely to abuse that prerogative and much more likely to do so in their own interest or in their own like biases or views, as opposed to what the public thinks or what society thinks as a whole. This looks like things like, for example, biased party appointments of certain judges, right? But notice also that these judges hold these positions for life, so it's extremely important, difficult to remove them and give them continual democratic accountability. They're much less accountable to the public. But also notice that the sort of people who enter into these offices are more elitist, right? Yes, politicians tend to be like more well off, but there's an increased drive to get diversity, to appeal to voters, etc. Notice you don't get this in Supreme Court appointments, and notice you also need far more education to be a Supreme Court justice. You need to publish in law journals. You often have to have higher education, attend law schools, have a PhD, which means you're going to be much more elitist and disconnected from what the average, like, reasonable person in that society views. So you trust this small group of 7, and there's also just far less of them, so you get much less diversity of opinion than in Congress, which means that you trust this far smaller group of people to make extremely important, like, decisions over what society values and what society does not value. I think this is really bad for several reasons. I think firstly, it's much more reversible. There are interpretations made by individual Supreme Court justices than an actual congressional amendment, right? Because notice, right, that it's far easier to reverse it because you simply just have to change your interpretation as you go through hearings rather than change the congressional amendment, so it's much more reliable and you know, like, for sure what you're getting when you're entering a hearing, and ideally all hearings would result in the same outcome regardless of the congressional justices, which means firstly that it's far harder to reverse a congressional amendment. So yes, on our side, it might be slower to get that change in the first place, but at least that change is much more stable and lasts over a longer period of time, which means that you as an individual who has gained rights based on the congressional amendment can trust that those rights will probably exist decades into the future rather than be reversed at the moment that you just changed one justice. Before I continue, I'll take a POI from opening.
This string of impacts is still contingent on getting more amendments on your side, but you're less likely to get them if you continue to glorify the founders, and any amendment has huge corollary impacts in terms of the change that you want.
So we're not glorifying the founders, because the fact that we can even amend the Constitution shows that we're not saying that what the founders said is perfectly correct or anything, right? But also, secondly, we also explain how there's democratic mechanism, which means that you have popular support to change the Constitution. And, like, if the Democrats run on this campaign of they want to institute certain policies, then to get those policies that people voted for them, they're going to have to change the Congress, change the Constitution. They don't have a choice. They can't just rely on Supreme Justice. And I think this is far more credible on our side when they do this, right? But secondly, right, you get far less politicization of the Supreme Court justices, which means that there's just far more trust that you're going to get a fair hearing in court, which means that people are much more likely to go to court and take their things to court and get those things upheld in court. I think this is really important at the point at which you have some respite or some ability to challenge the state and challenge things that have happened to you in court. I think we want people to be able to go to court. We want people to be represented by those courts. I think this is particularly expounded by after the Trump era, where there's a huge amount of distrust in the Democrats. I think separating yourself and making sure the Supreme Court is separate from that instills trust. And lastly, it's far more predictable what you get in court. People are much more likely to go to court because they know that they're going to be fairly representative and get a fair hearing. For all these reasons, very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that speech, calling upon the member of UP. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'll take a PI in the chat, probably from opening, around 5 or just before 6 minutes. Starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I want to be very explicit about the wording of the motion and what the full extent of the comparative is. Before proving why on our side you get more flexibility and you satisfy the moral principle better, even more than open opposition says, then feel the one hole that does exist in opening opposition, which is it's unclear how language changes in a way that we manage to satisfy the moral preferences of people that live in modern times. Let's first look at the motions. The motion is this House believes judges ought to interpret Constitution from originalist perspective. So all the motion does on the Gov side is make that the only possible interpretation. On the op side, all forms of constitutional interpretations are ones that can be allowed to exist. And this don't just mean originalism, textualism. Probably also means contextualism, which is a combination of the two that considers that we have to consider the current context that exists in our times. And what you probably get is judges that one judge that is in one school, another in one school, and on the Supreme Court, a combination of these judges simply by the semantic way this is worded. So for example, if we don't have a rule saying all pens ought to be black, you probably still have some black pens. We also have red, blue, and green pens. But two, at the point where it does ought have to be one way, it probably means that there are other that are considered morally right or that represent the profession of being a judge. All schools are credible, which means that in their formative years in university or early in their court careers, judges can probably pick either one of them. And by the point they raise up to the Supreme Courts, I think they can be either originalist, textualist, or contextualist on our side. Oh, did a very good job of explaining why textual ones are good. We are just saying that there are possible benefits by having a combination on our side, and these are the benefits that weigh more. What are these benefits? The first one is the moral way we satisfy the problem of laws coercing us. Notice that for reasons similar to what I says, the state power principle exists. We have laws that restrict us, but it's remarkably hard for us to say the preferences on the laws at the point where we can only vote certain times. We have limited accountability methods on our politicians, and a lot of like how law happens in courts through precedents and stuff that's beyond our control. The thing we uniquely change on our side when you can have multiple things is through the aggregations of different types of interpretations in the courts of the nation. You feasibly represent all possible preferences for interpretations that the citizens have, where if citizens don't have any interpretations, because we're not all legal scholars, at least all possible types of laws or possible interpretations of laws exist, such that the practical outcomes of interpretations at least align with the practical outcomes that people have. So insofar as the best solution to satisfy the state power principle problem is to give some level of interpretation, this happens with the increasive optionality that exists on our side of the house. Second of all, on changing the legislation and why this is good, I want to have an important piece of framing here. I don't think originalism versus contextualism versus textualism is the only metric by which judges are differentiated. I think judges can be progressive or conservative, and you have progressive originalists or textualists. And I do think the times when law changes is when the courts do have more progressive judges. aka when you passed Roe v. Wade, you had 5 progressive versus 4. When you repealed it, the thing changed in the favor of the conservatives. Why is just having originalism extremely bad at making things? One, I think you a priori consider the framers' intent. But two, notice how originalism works and perpetuates through history. The first interpretation of a constitution, by necessity, probably had to be originalist because you're interpreting the first text that appears. There wasn't much context added. There wasn't much change in the words at that time. When the only norm that exists is originalism, what you take is previous existing originalist works that started at the point where what the people thought of the founding fathers probably the same norms of the time. So the first originalists probably did think that a black man was worth 3/5 and had no reason to say, no, George Washington was better than this, because there was no better than this. Everyone probably thought it was at least morally okay to believe in this 3/5. How do things change on our side? The first one is simply by just not having originalism, we change the way change is framed. So larger degrees of change are permissible insofar as there isn't an existing concern or whether something can legitimately claim to be what an original right of the Constitution was. Two, just flexibility. Notice that, for example, Roe v. Wade is something that you best change by thinking of the context of abortion existence, while Brown versus the Board of Education probably requires you to, look at the texting and works better to a textual perspective, while other changes I do indeed concede, probably extending things that the founding fathers do say. The best way you can pick and choose for situations that are dire and hurt citizens is at the point where you have all of them. But three, with originalism, all judges opt into that. People who believe we should keep things the same are in general conservative. So the pool of judges in university that move in towards the Supreme Court are all a priori selected for conservatism, because usually originalism correlates with conservatism. So a priori you have more conservative judges. So you don't necessarily need to load the courts. It's because all the applicants you have for courts will tend on their side of the house to be way more conservative and not accept any change. Even if OG is correct and there are broad ways you can interpret the individual text, the people you put wouldn't be willing to do this. I'll take OG now.
Bottom half can't shift to Congress or normal judges because neither of them deal with constitution but with laws, and CO can't have both interpretations. You're doing a squirrel because you're saying sometimes we do originalist, sometimes we do textualist. You have to side for one of them.
I mean, I think the arguments apply to why textualism is good and originalism is uniquely bad. I think I explained enough in framing why it's logic to extend the comparative. Cool. How do we complete the mechanism of language actually changes? One, I think language doesn't have a meaning of itself. It changes based on our use. This is why you have archaic words. This is why you have new words. So language is self-moldable. Two, the interest in academia is often mapped change. Insofar as academics usually write dictionaries or technical texts that define legal terms, there is change in the words that used and the way people define within academia that trickles down into the interpretive work. Three, I think as we break down power norms, words that were previously considered not formal enough, colloquial words, are perceived as okay. Four, I think independently, we realize that adherence to discriminating minorities is relatively bad, which is why when we see, for example, the word man, we choose a priori to think that it says mankind, not necessarily people who are of the male gender, which proves that indeed language can change, and if you do want to change, you can probably do it relatively well through textual means, probably better if you combine all means. Proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. And now to end the debate for Gov half, I'm calling upon the Gov whip here.
Am I audible to everyone?
Yep, you are.
Lovely. There's a lot of disclarity in this debate. In textualism, you interpret the text and find different meanings within the different words within that text. In originalism, you interpret the text and find different meanings based on the context of what the founding fathers would have wanted us to do. It's not like in textualism, you literally just read the text, and it's not like in originalism, you literally just read the text. So there's flexibility on both sides, a nuance that I think the top half misses. The difference is the flexibility is in the judge's hands on side opposition, but on our side, it is based in the principles of the Constitution itself, but more importantly, it is based on the principles of the Constitution that the people, the democracy itself believes in. On our side of the house, we've proven it's far harder for there to be biases because those judges are far less able to maneuver. They have to standardize to a common originalist reading, and Congress sets the constitutional agenda. If we care about representative outcomes the most, this is far, far better. But on their side of the house, the judges have far different readings of words based on their own opinions, their own political predilections, or what is advantageous for you. So judges have far, far more power on their side of the house. This is the clearest depiction of what this debate has been about so far. Let us now go into why our material matters more. Before that, though, I want to deal with the sneaky POI we get from opening government when they try to say, oh, Congress has nothing to do with constitutional amendments. Just like check your history notes a little bit here. Congress votes to pass constitutional amendments. With a 2/3 majority in most political bodies, you can amend the Constitution, which is why Congress and the political body itself is an important actor. All right, why does all of this analysis matter so much? And I think that I'm just going to explain in the speech why this material alone wins us the debate without even having to rebut specifically a lot of the other things coming out from other teams. Firstly, because there is less equal application of rights, because the same case could be tried differently by two different judges who interpret the text differently, which means that the law itself is unfair. This means two things. Firstly, this means that there are dramatic swings in political outcomes, and precedent is far less respected because the Constitution is not defaulted on, but instead the judges individually themselves. But secondly, abortion might be protected today, but not tomorrow. On the counterfactual, there's a far stronger set of rights that apply to everybody through constitutional amendments which everybody supports. Secondly, the system becomes far less representative. Why? Because far more people consent into the Constitution than a single judge with much different political views imposing their own moral views onto you for the exact same reasons that opening opposition gives you, because these judges are unrepresentative, because they're privileged fucks or whatever. And because the Constitution is based on amendments which are continuously updated, OO says that their own principle is what the majority wants. But If there is sufficient will for certain amendments, those amendments will go through. They will have super majorities. So there's likely to be good interpretation. Finally, the most extreme ways this policy will be interpreted, like giving Black people no votes, clearly will not be followed. That is the kind of flexibility that our kind of reading is likely to achieve. Thirdly, I want to note that this level of judge flexibility is the key missing link from opening government's material for why the kind of court stacking they talk about is possible, why it is likely to be powerful, and why it is far less easy to hold to account. Because this is a policy that elevates the power of judges. Because now, compared to before, judges have far more interpretive power to do what they are talking about. That is why there is an incentive to put those judges into courts. They tie themselves up in knots here by trying to talk about flexibility on both sides, but they do not delineate why the difference is flexibility is important. Here is the weighing on all of this material. Here is why we win this debate. We don't know what is morally good. We don't know that abortion is good. That is an ongoing debate that exists. That might not be a good thing. It might kill fetuses. But we create less individual humans having total jurisdiction. The potential for total judicial overstepping on their side of the house increases far, far more. And there's matters in opening government's material because they're extremely unclear about what kinds of flexibility increases, and they try to have it all. We say that we trade off some judge flexibility for a more democratic system on the whole because Congress is far better and far more representative than the individual judges that individual politicians appoints. OO assert here that judges are far closer to our moral intuitions than the Constitution is, but that was the wrong comparative because on their side of the house, they get a period where Republicans can pump in Supreme Court justices and pursue decades of one-sided policy because they are appointed for life. Opening government had to prove this to explain why there's more judge fixing and worse judge fixing on their side of the house. We fill in this gap. Moreover, we explain why the comparative is not between judges and the Constitution. The comparative is between judges and the Congress, which makes constitutional amendments and updates that constitution regularly. What are the preemptive responses we get to this from opening opposition? Firstly, they say that it is hard to do constitutional amendments. But if our metric here, as OO lays out, is what the vast majority of people want, note that policies that are sufficiently supported will get constitutional amendments. So like basic things like Blacks being able to vote, women having rights, like basic rights will be protected and will be amended such. But secondly, even if you buy their logic, if something is very controversial and probably wouldn't get an amendment, then SCOTUS judges are unlikely to put that through. But even if they did, it would reverse far more easily on their side of the house. So their change isn't long-term at all. But secondly, that is what the key difference in this debate is. Because even if we have fewer rights on our side of the house, at least the rights that you do have are far more predictable and far less reversible. Your rights are far more protected for longer periods of time, and change is far more stable. This means that the most fundamental rights are consistently protected. You are protected against the worst forms of tyranny and the worst forms of judicial overreach. They say that you continue to glorify the founders, therefore the Constitution won't update. But like obviously you don't. There's a separation between the judges who are venerating the Constitution and the public and the people who might have different opinions about what the Constitution should be. Before I continue, I'll take OO.
Ordinary means that everyone alive right now, including legal critics and other judges, have a good idea that man implies people in general today. By contrast, founders are diverse and include like old guard repressive regimes. So why does this case not flip against you?
Again, you're looking at the wrong comparative. We explained why Congress is far more representative, why Congress is likely to create a good set of rights, why Congress should have power over that agenda. All right. Fourthly, equal application of the law is a far more important impact than anything else because there is no objective moral good. No one can settle whether abortion is good or bad, whether free speech is always good. But what we care about is that rights are consistent and equally applied, that anyone who takes a case to court will be treated equally. Finally, we also explained to you why more people are able to go to court and more people are able to access justice, which is a prerequisite to any of the top half's impacts. Because we explained why, because rights are far more unclear and far less stable on their side of the house, people do not feel as protected and therefore do not take their rights to claim in the first place. What is CO's response here? And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. They say that more greater changes are now permissible. But exactly, we say that those huge changes are not now by judges, but not Congresses, which we explain are literally far, far more representative. So their case did not respond to our material because our material flips it. It explains why the people who have power on our side of the house are far more better and far more representative than the judges who individually do on their side of the house. In doing so, we co-opt all of government's benefits and flip opposition's material. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Now to end the debate as a whole, the op whip, here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep. I think
Yeah,
if
awesome.
you could bring your mic a bit closer, that would be better.
Yeah, I'll just speak a bit louder. I think most themes in this debate don't give you likelihood analysis about what actually is likely to change. Top half talks about vast changes with regards to like massive policy changes and how you can actually get like things like changing abortion rights or whatnot. I think majority of these things are very hard to achieve. And if the incentives of like, oh, is correct, I think most of those things would have already been done. Firstly, I'm going to engage with CG's extension on why like Congress is more representative and why Congress has more power to interpret law. Secondly, I'll weigh off Stefan's extension against top half, right? What does CG tell you then? CG tells you that Congress is more representative and you should give Congress the ability and the power to actually interpret laws and like create these amendments, right? I think the first thing I want to note, I think is this kind of knifes OG, because like OG already says like constitutional amendments are incredibly difficult and like it's very hard to do. And like that is the reason why you don't carry them out in the first place, right? Like insofar as like there's no capacity proven, even in their best case, it's out. They can have their utopian world that it's like morally, right? I'm unclear as to what exactly changes in their world insofar as you don't tangibly change this, right? The second thing is they try to respond to this by saying, if like people really care about these issues, you can actually go and like gain super majorities in elections and you can actually vote them in and then you can get these congressional amendments, right? I think this is like a mischaracterization with regards to the constitutional amendments that are in status quo right now, right? I don't think the constitutional amendments that are existent are as black and white as giving black people rights or giving the women rights to vote. I think it's more nuanced takes about like abortion, about things like quotas or like reparations. That there is more nuances and there's like more gray areas and different moral metrics people weigh them off over, right? So I don't think it's as easy as they say. And insofar as it's not easy, you don't get the super majorities that people talk about and they want to get out of because you don't have the vast support, right? The third thing I want to note is I think this is like what mitigates them to the most extent, which means like their case is extremely like marginal and doesn't really take out, that people don't really vote based on singular issues. Like insofar it's not really proximate to them. I think like people like no one votes simply on one issue, right? So like even if they're correct, like even if one person has a concern with regards to constitutional amendments, I'm unclear as to why that vote is so more like overarching that they wouldn't care about any other things like economic policy or like any other policy about like environment or any other thing that is like the election is contested on, right? The final thing I want to note is like this idea about like even I just want to like contest their intuition that like more that represent like congressional bodies are simply more representative. Like I'm unclear as to why this representativeness is so important insofar as like the laws are going to be the same regardless, right? Like insofar as you like the laws are going to be interpreted regardless, I'm unclear as to why this representativeness is important. What then does Stefan tell you and why is it uniquely important? The first thing I want to note, not right now, is with regards to why uniquely when you have originalism, the judges that you will be pushing this and the judges will be coming up from from institutions and going into the Supreme Court will inherently be conservative. This is very important because this engages with OG's framing, right? About how you get more flexibility and how you're more likely to get nuanced takes, right? Insofar as the judges themselves are conservative and majority of the judges who go into higher levels, who are more qualified to be selected into the Supreme Court or more likely to be passed into these positions of power are inherently conservative. The amount of the pool of people you can select from is inherently restricted, right? So insofar as you create a normal, like when you normalize the fact that most judges should be originalists, you more likely limit the number of people you can pick from, and most of those people are going to be conservative, right? Stefan gives you two reasons for it. One, I think like the logic of originalism is that you value the past, you give value to the society that has already existed. Hence, you have to like those people give value to what was like the forefathers talked about, right? The second thing he tells you is the fact that those people want to protect what was said in the past and why they give value simply based on the fact that they were powerful and the people they respect, right? The reason why I want to differentiate this from our opening is that they don't give you the impact of as to why these people are socially conservative and why those judges are socially conservative, right? And that is uniquely important with regards to engaging with OG's case, right? Because insofar as they don't tell you that these judges are going to be conservative, so even if they're correct, that you get more flexibility, I'm unclear as to why that flexibility leads to actual change, because those judges are inherently more socially conservative. Hence, they want to continue to maintain this idea of like maintaining the status quo and maintaining the laws that already exist, right? The second thing I want to note is with regards to the idea of like how we take like this sneaky route and like get a balance of both, right? I think that's like a fair like interpretation of the motion, right? Like we ought to do one thing in one scenario, but we ought to do another thing based on the context of another scenario, right? And they're the only side who gave you that nuance, right? Because we don't have to defend a world where we only use one system simply regardless of the context and regardless of the circumstances we're dealing with, right? And Stefan already gave you reasons as to why this would be beneficial and why this would give you the flexibility that OG and government is talking about with regards to laws changing, right? I think this is uniquely important because insofar as we prove you flexibility, we are more likely to get the changes that like even O is trying to push for, right? I'll finally go on to weigh against O before that OG. That's all.
Look, your law doctrine is not reflective of your political inclination. You can be originalist in interpreting liberally forefathers and relying on America, land of freedom of choice. This is about what judges should choose to do. It's not dependent on who they are.
So in most cases, like you pick your interpretation of something based on your identity and things that are important to your preferences and identity, right? Insofar as you pick the thing like originalism and you already have other options that you can pick from, you're more likely to be socially conservative because that is why you pick the socially conservative interpretation of the law, because you think that is valuable rather than the newer interpretations, right? I think it's logical to presume that people don't have like bipolar personalities where they pick one thing to law and they be like a really liberal, like progressive person with regards to other aspects of their life, right? I think this like kind of like misses the nuance that Stefan gives you. The reason why we weigh off against our opening is for two reasons. One, I think the majority of the things they talk about with regards to policy changes are extremely unlikely to happen to the extent they're talking about, right? Because I think in most cases, these politics are extremely polarized, right? So that means even in their best case, you might get something marginally different, but that would exist regardless of the judge's interpretation because you're already having social capital around it. I'm unclear as to why uniquely having these different judges' interpretations with regards to textualism is the tipping point for all the changes they're talking about, right? On the comparative, we are more likely to get that, and they're more likely to have more rights for minorities and things like that, because simply we have more flexibility with regards to interpretation, right? Simply based on like a likelihood analysis on how likely we're going to get the change and what exactly changes with regards to status quo. I think we weigh off against them on that, right? But two, only simply based on their own moral metric about how you want to be more proximate to the status quo right now, we weigh off against them, right? Because we prove to you when you have multiple different interpretations and judges from different backgrounds, that is when you get the most amount of flexibility with regards to current context and with regards to current people's preferences, right? So that we feel the metric of morality and how they're more proximate to you in a greater degree. I think we win this video. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech and thank everyone for this wonderful debate as a whole. So that concludes the Open Grand Finals of Uhuru Worlds 2023. So I think since there are a lot of people here, I guess the judges could just move to Discord on Judge